Chapter 13. After Amelia's unanticipated announcement, Maxwell stared blankly at Fenton, unable to think of a single thing to say. Anger was definitely swelling up inside him, and he was now absolutely positive sending for his brother had been a huge mistake. He'd just been informed, in a dreadfully abrupt way, that the man he hated more than any other adversary was in fact related to him, albeit distantly. Still, he had to admit to himself that the situation, were he a mere spectator, would have been rather comical and entertaining. Fenton, feeling the awkwardness of the moment, decided to take advantage of his brother's sudden vulnerability. "As you can imagine, my dear brother, my wife and I have missed each other greatly these past few days. You wouldn't mind if we retired earlier than usual, would you?" Maxwell grimaced to himself, the innuendo not lost on him. "Is there anything I can do for you, Amelia? You've had a long journey. Perhaps some refreshment before you retire?" "I will see to her needs, little brother," Fenton condescendingly replied. "Good night." He took his lady's hand to lead her from the room. Amelia stopped, turning back and smiling graciously. "Thank you for the offer, Maxwell. I am glad to meet you at last. Good night." "Good evening, my lady. Fenton?" Maxwell watched them ascend his spectacular mahogany staircase with an acerbic look on his face. His brain hurt with all of his now obliterated schemes and plans. What was to be done now? Why did his brother not inform him of this connection? Was Reign aware of it? Did Reign know now that his sister would be sleeping beside the mayor's brother in the mayor's own home? What had Amelia explained upon his mention of her brother's name? "Oh, Fenton, do you mean that you've finally discovered Paxton?" The implications of this question revolved in his mind. Obviously, Paxton and his sister weren't communicating with one another. And even more obvious was the fact that Fenton had everything to do with it. Once cosily situated in their room, Fenton sat in the armchair by the fireplace and watched his wife as she unpacked her belongings. She was, he supposed, very beautiful and intelligent, but he was convinced he'd never really loved her. He had, despite his true intentions, started to like her, and perhaps even admire her, but he had no qualms on using her to destroy her brother. Memories of the past stirred in his imagination as he clearly recalled the events that had led up to that first meeting and consequently his first impression of Paxton Reign. The year was 1857, and Fenton had just celebrated his 13th birthday. His father, in a rare display of affection, had patted him on the head and told him he was a boy who seemed to possess an innate talent for outwitting people. "It's truly a shame, my son, that you'll probably never play a game of bluff. You would have excelled at it." His father was referring to one of his favorite pastimes, a game played with 20 cards and known as bluff. Romulus Stanton had been an avid bluff player, and prided himself on his own ability to destroy people. Unfortunately for Romulus, bluff had been replaced by a fashionable 52-card game called poker. Mr. R. Stanton had, on a few occasions, attempted this new game. He detested it, saying it lacked the danger, challenge, and thrill of bluff. Fenton, however, was sure that his father's dislike of poker was due to the fact he was not as good at it as he was at bluff. In the years that followed, Fenton devoted himself to learning the game of poker in all its forms. Not only would he prove Romulus right about his skills, but he'd also rise above him in a sense, since he'd never mastered the game of poker. Fenton was, as his father had predicted, naturally drawn to the game of poker because it was a game of power, and it encouraged his aptitude for manipulation. It didn't take long for Fenton to become obsessed with the game. He played it constantly, morning, noon, and night. His mother often chided him, frequently reminding him of the evils of gambling and obsession. In rebuttal to her recurrent complaints, her son would nonchalantly belittle her concerns with comments like, "Mother, I wish you wouldn't worry. I'm the best poker player in the city," and "I win practically every time I sit at a table. I wish you knew my reputation." Or his personal favorite, "I'm making more money this way than I'd ever at a regular job." Although this fact was indisputable, she wasn't placated, and even on her deathbed in the winter of 1865, she begged him to stop playing the game. Fenton, repressing the urge to roll his eyes, lifted her hand, patting it softly with his own. "Mother, if it will ease your passing, I promise you, if I ever lose more than $1,000 in a week, I will stop." This was a reasonable promise in his mind, because he'd never lost more than 500. He prided himself on his inherent wisdom. He knew when to play his cards and when to withdraw. She'd shook her head sadly and sighed, but changed the subject nonetheless. Not long after her death, Maxwell had run away, and it was years later that the eldest Stanton boy first encountered Paxton Reign. 1872 was turning out to be a very successful year for Fenton Stanton. He was at the top of his game in all respects. He played poker almost every other night. The money and fame it was affording him was very much to his liking. One evening, Paxton Reign had casually entered the saloon and sat down at his table. Mr. F. Stanton had stiffened visibly. He'd read about this bounty hunter and his famous exploits in the newspaper, but it was not his fame that was intimidating. There was a subtle aura of power about him, one that Fenton realized with trepidation rivaled his own. After the game was over and everyone vacated the table, Fenton sat there contemplating that Paxton Reign was possibly the only man in his world who could pose a threat to him. The bounty hunter indisputably endangered his unmarred record of eventually out-bluffing every player. Following that evening, Fenton and Reign met at several of the same establishments where the game of poker flourished. Reign was always a worthy opponent, and despite his previous assertions of the danger this man posed to his reputation, Fenton was glad of the challenge. After all, when you're one of the cleverest poker players in the land, worthy opponents were few and far between. Yet, as time progressed, Fenton's fears were realized, and Reign's fame seemed to overshadow his own. Even with Paxton's rare participation in the game, due to his occupation he was often gone for weeks at a time, men had begun to mention him when he was absent, and talk about his exploits. His adversary's good reputation was driving Fenton into a jealous frenzy. Fenton became determined to become the talk of the town once more, and not this sideshow tracker. He had to find a way to obliterate Reign from the minds of his opponents and the general poker-playing population. This would be no easy task, and so Fenton had unwillingly found yet another obsession. In time, he'd invented an uncomplicated scheme to not only rid the saloons of talk about Paxton Reign, but to catapult his own reputation beyond simple saloon gossip also. Fenton Stanton, being the wealthy and influential man that he was, traveled in upper-class circles, and hence had many affluent connections. Conveniently, he was a personal acquaintance of the owners of a new and exclusive resort on Lake Mohonk in New Paltz, New York. The Smiley twins, Alfred and Albert, were, as Fenton put it, in awe of him, and were ambitious in their own right. They'd certainly be open to any scheme that would elevate their reputations or the repute of their resort, Mohonk Mountain House. Lake Mohonk was aptly nicknamed Lake in the Sky, and had recently become one of his favorite getaway spots. Quite incidentally, this resort also happened to be a perfect location for his devious designs. Upon receiving Fenton's request to allow him to sponsor and arrange a modest poker tournament to be held at Mohonk Mountain House, the Smiley twins were overjoyed. This would be the ideal opportunity for them to mark their little getaway on the map and make a hefty profit at the same time. They promptly wrote back, assuring Mr. F. Stanton that Mohonk Mountain House would welcome any and all of his guests. It was decided there would be 100 elite poker players invited to join this tournament, and that the buy-in would not be preposterous. Fenton's main goal was to interest Reign, but he needed others, and, in all fairness, players would be shouldering the expense of the weekend accommodations as well. So Fenton decreed that each player would pay $1,000 to purchase a position in the tournament. There would be no buyback. Once you were out, you were out. Specifically, the tournament would be 2 days in length, and consist of 10 tables, each with 10 players, and a grand prize of $100,000. Fenton publicized the news, and soon most of the people with whom he claimed an acquaintance were advertising the weekend poker tournament for him. It was soon the talk of the town, and he only had to make sure that Reign was there. Personally sending Paxton a telegram, requesting his presence at the tournament, and indicating that he wouldn't need to pay for any expense, was Fenton's ultimate decision. His stomach had literally clenched when he received word that Reign had accepted his invitation. A guaranteed strategy that would prevent Reign from winning the tournament was all he needed now. Upon consideration, he had smiled to himself, positive there were no chances of Reign beating him. A strategy would be a waste of his valuable time and effort. He would win. The weekend of the tournament finally arrived, and as Fenton had previously arranged, the invited players and their families journeyed to New Paltz together in a large, eye-catching caravan of fine horses and elaborate carriages. They arrived with unforgettable style in the late afternoon, and spent the rest of the day relaxing, eating, and preparing for the following day. Saturday was a long day. Fenton remembered they played the whole day through with only 4 one-hour breaks. Finally, well into the wee hours of the morning, each of the 10 tables had a single winner. The final table was assembled the next day, and Fenton was dismayed, and yet strangely pleased, to find that Paxton Reign was one of his opponents. He'd hoped Reign would lose early and fade into oblivion, but no such luck was awarded Mr. F. Stanton. The sun had set, and Fenton was relishing the challenge laid before him, and eager to win. There were only 4 players left of the 10 who'd started that day, and unfortunately Paxton was one of them. In a fury of impatience, Fenton had taken a risk, a big risk, and went all in on an ace high. To his pleasure, all the other players folded, fearful of a hand that would make the host of the tournament go all in. But Reign had stayed in, and crushed him with a mere pair of 4s. This, of course, illustrated that Paxton had seen right through his bluff when none of the others had. When Reign had lain down his hand, revealing that he had won with practically nothing, Fenton had gone through various emotions. First, he'd felt surprise. Once that had worn off, he'd actually reddened with embarrassment. Seconds later, when the referee called a break, and Reign had collected his earnings, expressed humble gratitude for the game thus far, shook Fenton's hand, and left the table, Fenton experienced the worst rage that had ever come over him. No one at that table would have known it, though. He was certain of that, because he had made some witty remark which made them all laugh, stood up, bowed his head in a respectful gesture, and left the table, his dignity intact. Before the tournament had even ended, Fenton Stanton knew Reign would win the $100,000, and all the fame that came with it. With a shiver of regret, Fenton allowed the experience of complete and utter failure to wash through him. It was at that very moment he remembered the promise he had made to his mother, which he had always intended to keep, and the pain intensified tenfold. Not only had Fenton been deprived of his fame and additional fortune, but also of his only love, poker. As he walked alone in the beautiful gardens that night, he schemed on yet another plan to completely ruin his newly dubbed arch-nemesis, Paxton Reign. He no longer desired to merely erase Reign's name from the lips of common and illustrious poker players alike, but to attack the man's soul, heart, and mind. In short, Fenton schemed to totally annihilate Paxton Reign. This proved to be more complicated than Fenton had originally anticipated. Paxton didn't gamble, except the occasional game of poker. He rarely drank. He was honest in his dealings, and was well liked by everyone. Fenton contrived to have him assassinated, but he stopped short of this plan. Paxton was a well-known bounty hunter, and his skills would likely prevent any such plan from being accomplished. Fenton also rationalized that having a man murdered simply because he beat you at your own game seemed beneath a Stanton. No, he would wait, and soon enough a way to invoke his revenge would present itself. And so it had, when he'd had the good fortune of meeting Miss Amelia Reign.